The afternoon rain had finally stopped when Sarah Mitchell first noticed him sitting on her porch steps. She was 58 years old, a widow of 3 years, and had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of her days in this small Georgia town. But there he was, a young man, maybe in his early 30s, with a worn backpack beside him and mud on his shoes. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked gently, pushing open her screen door. He looked up, and she saw exhaustion in his dark eyes. His black hair was damp from the rain, and his denim shirt bore the stains of travel. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am," he said with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "I was walking to town and the storm caught me. I just needed a moment to rest." Something in his voice reminded Sarah of her own son, who lived far away now. "You look like you could use more than a moment," she said. "Come inside. I'll make some coffee." His name was Daniel Torres, and over the next hour, sitting at her kitchen table, he told her his story. He was traveling across America, he said, trying to see the country on foot with very little money. He'd been doing odd jobs along the way, but work had been scarce lately. Sarah listened the way she'd learned to listen over 6 decades of life, not just to the words, but to what lay beneath them. She heard loneliness in his voice and something else, a searching quality, the kind she recognized in herself some days. "You must be hungry," she said finally. It wasn't really a question. Over the next 3 days, Daniel stayed in Sarah's guest room. She told herself it was just Christian charity, the way she'd been raised. But truthfully, the house felt less empty with someone in it. They fell into an easy routine. He helped her with chores, fixing the loose board on the porch, clearing the gutters, weeding the garden her late husband Tom had planted. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and talked. Daniel told her about the places he'd seen, the people he'd met. Sarah told him about her life, 40 years of marriage, 2 children grown and gone, a teaching career that had filled her days with purpose. She told him about Tom, and how the silence after he passed had been the hardest part. "You learn something as you get older," Sarah said one evening, watching fireflies dance in the yard. "Life doesn't always turn out the way you planned, but sometimes the detours are where you find the real treasures." Daniel nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say something similar. She raised me, actually. I lost her last year." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, and meant it. "She taught me that kindness matters more than success," Daniel continued quietly. "That how you treat people when you have nothing to gain, that's who you really are." On the 4th morning, Sarah made breakfast as usual. But Daniel seemed different, quieter, almost nervous. "I need to tell you something," he said, setting down his coffee cup. "I haven't been entirely honest with you." Sarah's heart sank a little. She'd been a teacher long enough to recognize a confession coming. "I'm not really broke," Daniel said, meeting her eyes. "I mean, I am traveling. That part's true, but I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because I wanted to see America the way real people see it. To understand what matters to ordinary folks when all the money and status is stripped away." Sarah waited. She'd learned that silence often brings more truth than questions. "My family has money," Daniel continued. "A lot of it. My full name is Daniel Torres Castellano. My grandmother was Elena Castellano. Maybe you've heard of her?" Sarah shook her head. "Should I have?" "She founded Castellano Industries. When she passed, I inherited, well, everything. Suddenly, I had more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. And I realized I didn't know anything about real life, about what mattered. So I left it all behind for a while. Started walking." He looked down at his hands. "I've stayed with maybe 20 families like this. Most didn't give me a second glance. A few called the police. You're the first who invited me in, no questions asked. Who treated me like I mattered, not because of what I had, but just because I was human." Sarah absorbed this quietly. Then she smiled. "Well, you did fix my gutters. That mattered quite a bit." Daniel laughed, and some of the tension left his shoulders. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah asked. "Because I'm leaving tomorrow, and because you deserve honesty. You gave me something precious. You reminded me what my grandmother tried to teach me. That kindness is its own currency, the only one that really matters." They spent that last evening on the porch again, talking like old friends. When Daniel left the next morning, Sarah hugged him the way she hugged her own children. "You take care of yourself," she said. "And remember, having money doesn't make you bad. It's what you do with it that matters." I will, he promised. 3 weeks passed. Sarah settled back into her quiet routine, though the house seemed a bit emptier now. She thought about Daniel sometimes, wondered where his journey had taken him. Then one Saturday afternoon, a long black limousine pulled up in front of her house. Sarah was in the garden, wearing her old overalls and dirt on her knees. She stood up slowly, confused, as the driver emerged and opened the back door. Daniel stepped out, wearing an elegant suit but looking just as uncertain as he had that first rainy day. "Hello, Sarah," he said softly. "Well," Sarah said, brushing dirt from her hands, "this is quite an entrance." Daniel smiled, but his eyes were serious. "I wanted to come back, to tell you something important." They sat on the porch steps just as they had before. The limousine waited at the curb, absurdly out of place on this quiet street. "After I left here, I finished my journey," Daniel began. "Walked all the way to California. And the whole time, I kept thinking about what you said, about detours and treasures, about what really matters." He took a breath. "I've decided to use my inheritance the way my grandmother would have wanted. I'm creating a foundation to help people, families like yours, communities like this one. Not just throwing money at problems, but really listening. Really understanding what people need." Sarah felt her eyes grow warm. "That's wonderful, Daniel. But I needed to come back here first," he continued. "To thank you properly. And to confess something." "Another confession?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The last one, I promise." He smiled. "You changed my life, Sarah. In 3 days, you taught me more about being a decent human being than I learned in 32 years before that. You didn't see a rich man or a poor man. You just saw someone who needed kindness. And you gave it freely." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you. Not because I think kindness can be bought. I know it can't. But because you mentioned once that you dreamed of visiting your daughter in Seattle, but the flight was expensive." Sarah opened the envelope. Inside were plane tickets. Round trip to Seattle, first class. "Daniel," she started, but her voice caught. "Please," he said gently, "let me do this. Not to repay you, that's impossible, but to honor what you gave me." Sarah looked at this young man, who'd come to her porch as a stranger and left as something more. She thought about all the years she'd taught children that goodness matters, that kindness ripples outward in ways we can't always see. Here was living proof. "Thank you," she said finally. "Not just for the tickets, but for coming back, for remembering." "How could I forget?" Daniel said. "You saw me when I was invisible. That's a gift I'll spend the rest of my life trying to pass on." They talked for another hour, and this time there were no secrets between them. Daniel told her about his foundation plans, asked her advice about how to really help communities like hers. Sarah, who'd spent her life teaching, found herself teaching one more lesson, that money without wisdom is useless, but wisdom without compassion is hollow. When Daniel finally left, climbing back into that absurd limousine, Sarah stood on her porch and waved. She watched until the car disappeared around the corner, then looked down at the envelope in her hand. Inside, tucked behind the tickets, was a note in Daniel's handwriting, to Sarah, who reminded me that the richest people aren't those with the most money, but those with the biggest hearts. With gratitude and love, Daniel, Sarah sat down on her porch steps. The same steps where a tired traveler had rested 3 weeks ago. She thought about the strange circuitousness of life, how sometimes the people we help end up helping us right back, how sometimes a stranger becomes family, how sometimes 3 days can matter more than 3 years. The afternoon sun was warm on her face. Somewhere across the country, her daughter was waiting for a phone call about a surprise visit. And here in this small Georgia town, in this quiet house that had once seemed so empty, Sarah Mitchell smiled. She had learned in her 58 years that life is full of surprises, that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes when you open your door to a stranger in the rain, you open your door to something far more precious, a reminder of what it means to be human. She folded the note carefully and tucked it in her pocket next to her heart. Some treasures, she thought, you don't find on the road you plan to travel. You find them on the detours, in the unexpected moments, in the spaces between what you expect and what life gives you instead, and she was grateful for every single one.